Stephanie is the managing editor of Reason magazine. She works specifically in the area of the intersection between politics and religion. She is a fellow of journalism, the Robert Novak Fellow of Journalism, and a finalist for the Bastiat Prize in Journalism as well. Prior to working with Reason magazine, she was a pollster, a speechwriter, and a contributor to America Magazine, no stranger to a Jesuit, and to U.S. News and World Report. And she's going to be speaking to us today about freedom and the common good. So, Stephanie, thanks so much for stepping in and for doing this early, and we're most grateful to hear your insights today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As mentioned, I am a journalist with Reason magazine, which is a magazine of politics and culture that covers the world from a libertarian perspective. So I'm here to speak to you about my love of freedom. I specifically wanted to chat with you guys about something that you maybe have noticed, some ideas that you maybe have noticed or heard of that are a little bit in the zeitgeist over the last few years. And they tend to be talked about under terms like common good conservatism or common good capitalism or common good constitutionalism. And they have some pretty high-profile proponents, people like Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things magazine, Senator Marco Rubio, and Adrian Vermeule, a Harvard University law professor, although there are plenty of other people beyond those who have been sort of talking about these ideas. The thing that I think unites them all, though, is that they're pretty dissatisfied with the state of the world right now. But not just that, they're not just dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied and they believe that the answer to many of our sort of social ills is for conservatives and people of faith to get comfortable with a more muscular use of state power in order to solve our problems. So they'll say things like, you know, we've tried this individual liberty limited government thing and we just do not like where it has gotten us. And so it's time to try something else. At a more concrete level, I wanted to share a few of the examples of the policies that you'll often hear them talking about. They'll say things like, we should be supportive of government subsidies for families, for child rearing. We should be trying to encourage people to have more kids by paying them to support the raising of children. We should be willing to regulate big tech and if need be, break it up if it's promoting ideas that are bad for the family and bad for society. And we should maybe consider dispensing with a sort of free speech absolutism that says that the government should not regulate or censor speech such as obscenity or blasphemy or things like any kind of dangerous speech. The government does, they would say, the government does have a role regulating and maybe even censoring speech that's dangerous and bad for families. So you may be asking yourself, you know, how you should feel about this sort of common good oriented policy agenda, whether it actually, these sorts of ideas actually would be good for the common good, whether they actually would promote a good society and a good life. And so that's the question I want to sort of address here and walk you through where I come down on this. The first question, of course, that you have to ask, what is the common good? Fortunately, as Catholics, we have a resource that can help us answer that question. This is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. I think in layman's terms, the way I tend to think of it, which is just a slight tweak on this, is that the common good is the conditions that promote human flourishing and that allow for human flourishing. So that's what the common good is all about. And the Catechism goes on to specify that the common good definitely has to include respect for the person, social well-being and development of the group, that's the common component, and stability and security. These are the types of things that the common good is all about, the types of conditions we're talking about. I interviewed Father David Hollenbach, a Jesuit priest who is he's a professor at Georgetown and an expert on these things. And he added this extra layer, which I think is very important, that the common good, it's there for us all if it's there at all. It's not something that you can take it and divide it up and give everybody a private piece of it. It's inherently shared. Again, this is the common component of common good. I think it helps to be a little bit more concrete again about what we're talking about here. And so these are the three examples that I tend to mentally focus on myself. What is the common good? Well, it's things like peace, justice, and material abundance. Peace is the one that's most obvious for understanding the common component, right? If our country is at peace, we're all at peace, and we all benefit from being at peace. If our country is at war, that affects everybody. And if an enemy army invades across the northern border into Maine, and you're in Texas, you don't say, well, that's New England's problem. Our country is now at war. It's a common situation. So peace is a common good, justice, and material and abundance. But material abundance, I add a little asterisk, because it is one that can be misunderstood, I think, and sometimes people on my own side will, I think, misunderstand or misuse the idea of material abundance. It's very important that this be not just private gain, right? And I want to tell a couple of stories to try to illustrate this point. These are two stories that are going to be found in the forthcoming issue of Reason magazine, where I work. The next issue of the magazine is a special theme issue that we're putting out to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, which is this year in December. So there's two stories that appear in this issue. The first one I'm guessing many of you maybe have heard or remember, and that was in the early 1990s. Boris Yeltsin came to the United States as part of a state visit, and he stopped off at a grocery store in Houston called Randall's, and he walked mesmerized through the aisles of this grocery store. He could not believe his eyes. He could not believe the incredible quality and selection and abundance and choice that he found on display. And he actually thought that it was a plant, a sort of fake Potemkin grocery store that had been, the State Department had created in order to bring him to, in order to sort of freak him out about how rich America really was. But of course that wasn't true. There were, he could have gone to any one of a dozen other grocery stores in the Houston area and found exactly the same thing. He could have gone to hundreds and hundreds of grocery stores around the country and found exactly the same thing. Any American at that point could walk into any grocery store and find a wide variety of healthy and nutritious and delicious food available at a reasonable price and lots of options, and that was just the norm in America at that time. And actually, Yeltsin said, if the Russian people could see what I just saw, the Soviet Union would fall overnight. They wouldn't put up with it anymore. And in fact, that's not that far off from what actually happened. That's the first story. The second story is what grocery shopping was like in the Soviet Union at the time. It depended, unlike here, it depended on what your status was within the Communist Party. If you were a regular Russian citizen, you would go to a grocery store and you would be faced with scarcity, rationing, bare shelves, minimal selection, gross options. But if you were an elite member of the Communist Party, if you were a high-level member of the party, there were special grocery stores that only you got to shop at. And they would hang heavy curtains in the windows of those grocery stores so that people out on the streets couldn't see in and see the luxury that wasn't available to them. That's the story that I tell because I think it illustrates this point about material abundance and what it is and what it isn't. It's not just, wealth for some at the expense of others. It's a society in which the economy produces abundance that's available to everyone. That's the component of the common good that we're talking about here. So the next question here is, that's the common good. What does freedom have to do with it? Well, I want to argue that freedom is both a component of the common good and a condition for other components of the common good. The first part of this is that freedom is a good thing in and of itself. A society in which people are not free cannot be a good society. A society in which people are free is going to be closer to attaining the conditions for human flourishing than one in which they're not. And I think that we all basically intuitively understand this, actually. I trust. So here's an image. This is an image of chattel slavery, the institution of slavery that existed in this country up until about 150 years ago. And I trust that everyone in this room is convinced already and doesn't need to be persuaded that this was just a morally deplorable institution. and that a society in which some people own other people, and in which some people are not free, they do not have the freedom to control their lives, to make choices, to pursue, to support their family, to choose how to make a living, to pursue the good as they understand the good and not as somebody else tells them they should, that is not a good society. And I trust we all believe and agree that when this institution of slavery was eliminated, that we got closer to achieving a good society, that we came a little bit closer to the common good. This is because just as slavery is inherently evil, it's not just bad, in an instrumental way, because slaves aren't as productive as wage laborers or something. No, it's bad in and of itself. And the sort of flip side of that, I think, is that freedom is good in and of itself. So I wanted to point out that I think the justice component, the middle of this one, is very, very clearly tied to this. A just society is not, you can't have a just society if some people own other people, if some people get to control the lives of other people. That's just not a just society, in part because it means that some members of this society are having their inherent equal human dignity that they have, by virtue of being a human being created in the image and likeness of God, is being denied to them. That dignity is being denied to them because their freedom is being denied to them, that those things are tied together, and that they are very much relevant to the question of, is this a just society? Do we have justice in that aspect of the common good? So freedom is, I think, I would argue, a component of the common good. It's good unto itself. But I would also say that freedom is a prerequisite for many other good things. It is also an instrumental good. I'm a libertarian, and libertarians love to show a particular graph. The one I have here is a little bit out of date, but I'm going to show it anyway. It definitely gets the picture across. This is what it looks like. It's world GDP over the last 2,000 years. And what you see is that for the vast majority of human history, and certainly for most of the 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, humanity lived entirely at a level that would be considered by our standards to be abject poverty. And although there are many theories about what it was that caused us to turn that incredible, miraculous corner, I think there's no question that the Industrial Revolution and the sort of globalization and opening up of the world to global trade were driving factors in this outcome. And there were a number of norms and institutions that grew up, that we developed through trial and error, that sort of developed along this, during the same period, during this incredible wealth-generating moment of human history. Things like due process, free speech, religious liberty, global trade, as I mentioned, freedom of movement, low taxes, separation of powers. These are the norms and institutions that I think most people would agree contributed to making this moment that we are lucky enough to live in the most peaceful and prosperous of any moment that any human beings have ever known in the history of the world. Despite all of the flaws and failings of our current society, I think that which is a hockey stick chart as well, to point back to a couple of presentations ago, that hockey stick chart of wealth increase over time and increasing peace and prosperity over time is pretty hard to argue with. So that would be peace and prosperity. That would be the first and third of these, I think. Right? Peace, material abundance, prosperity. There are really good things that have happened as a result of these institutions. Maybe I'll go back one. These institutions that we have developed to try to keep this good thing going. And if you look closely at this list, I think what you're going to find is that it all boils down to two things, which is individual liberty and limited government, which you may recall are exactly the things that these so-called common good types have suggested that we have put too much faith in and need to reconsider. So now I want to offer my takeaways from both economic theory and lived experience of the last 2,000 years, and especially the last few hundred years. There are people who want a more muscular government. Here are my 3 laws of muscular government that we have to always grapple with. And good intentions do not get you around dealing with these 3 things. 1, the state is bad at everything it does. Often it fails to accomplish the things that it sets out to accomplish. If it does make progress in fixing a problem, often it does it in the least efficient, most wasteful possible way. And frequently, it actually makes the underlying problem worse, because good intentions may have in sight one outcome and have no idea what the second or third order effects of a particular government policy might be. The state, I think, has shown itself to be pretty bad at pretty much everything it does. That's my first law of muscular government. The second law, we won't always be the ones in charge. It's one thing to support a big, strong, powerful government if you're sure that you're going to be in charge of it, or people who see the world the way you do and sort of share your general values. But that's not always going to be the case, and I think we have seen that. We know that to be true. There's no guarantee, especially in a free society, in a democratic order, a regime, of guaranteeing that the people who take the reins of power after you exit the room are going to be ones who value the same things that you value. So that's a thing that you should keep in mind before you sort of decide to go down the road of expanding government or embracing a more muscular or robust government agenda. And the third thing, I think this one is fairly self-explanatory, power corrupts. Even if you are the ones in charge, even if people who agree with you are the ones in charge, even if you have the best possible intentions and really good ideas and all of that, it's very hard to prevent the lure of power from corrupting you and from tempting you in directions that you might not otherwise want to go. So I want to do a little case study, take a moment, and say, here's a example of these laws that I think are, this is a fairly well understood phenomenon. I don't think I'm going to be telling you anything you don't know. I want to talk about welfare policy and welfare spending, and in fact, this graph shows an increase in welfare spending over time, over the course of about 50, 66 years. You could go back even farther than that, go back to the New Deal in the 1930s, fast forward to the Great Society, to the War on Poverty, right on up to expansions of Medicare Part D under the George W. Bush administration. And in the last 2 years, we have seen, in fact, an unprecedented, almost unthinkable amount of money pushed, government spending inserted into the economy in response to the pandemic. So various programs that could be considered welfare spending or aid right, to people who can't pay their rent, for businesses who might not be able to make payroll, a pretty dramatic expansion of unemployment insurance for people who find themselves out of work. The question that we have to ask ourselves, I think, is what has been the result of this spending? Has it accomplished the thing that it was supposed to accomplish, that we set out to do with it? Now, I'm sure of a few things. I'm sure that government spending, aid spending, welfare spending, humanitarian assistance of various kinds have helped people. I have no doubt about that, and I don't deny it. But I think that the sort of return on investment of the sheer amount of money that we have spent on programs like this is pretty hard to justify, given what we have gotten in terms of nudging or changing the underlying poverty rates and things like that. And in addition to that, I think we have seen at least 2 serious forms of negative unintended consequences that have come out of these programs. One of those involves the effect it has had on the people, the recipients of the aid, and the ways in which government welfare programs train people to believe that they lack agency, that they are not responsible for solving their own problems, for bettering their life, for supporting themselves and their families, but rather that if there's something wrong in my life, it's the government's job to fix it. And if it's not getting better, then it's the government's job to spend more to fix it and to do more to help me. I think most of us probably remember over the last couple of decades, I think there's very salient instances of this playing out in inner cities that most people are aware of. But I don't think we should underestimate the ways in which this also applies in a number of rural communities where there are a lot of people where their jobs dry up, and instead of thinking creatively about what can I do to help myself, to be a productive member of society, to support my family, to better my community, they go on disability. They look for other state support for for their way of life, such as it is, as opposed to thinking creatively and innovatively about how can they improve their lot and contribute to society. So this is a thing I think that comes, it's a way in which well-intentioned policies that certainly were meant to help the least among us can make the underlying problem worse, where people have sort of learned helplessness that comes as opposed to a hand up that then allows them to help themselves going forward. That's one form of unintended consequences from government policy. It's not the only kind, though. I think there is another example or another way in which government policy can have negative, sort of harmful, unintended consequences. And in this case, I would say that it's the effects of this kind of spending not on the recipients of the aid, but on people like us. On the people who are members of communities who have been trained now over the course of nearly a century of these, if you go back to the New Deal, of these policies, to no longer think that if my neighbor is hurting, or my neighbor is in need or falls on hard times, that I'm on the front lines of, my job is to be on the front lines of helping them. I think there's a lot of economic and political science literature to back this up. There's a real crowding out effect that happens when government policy comes in, when government programs come in, that civil society institutions are crowded out. They're pushed out of that space. It's very hard for private and voluntary solutions to get anywhere when they're competing against the sort of unlimited spigot of state money. And in some cases, in not a few cases, you have the state that actively goes after and bans or push, aggressively, intentionally pushes out private alternatives from the marketplace. We just got done with a Supreme Court case in which the city of Philadelphia attempted to shut down a Catholic adoption agency. It didn't like the competition from somebody who wasn't going to buy into sort of the city government's beliefs and sort of ideological beliefs about gender and sexuality. And it tried to ban them from operating in the city. And thankfully, the Supreme Court sort of intervened in this case. But you have many instances of state governments, local governments, in some cases the federal government saying, our job is to help people and you're just in the way. You're just spreading bigotry. So step aside. So this crowding out effect, this way in which I think well-intentioned government policy and welfare programs can actually make it harder for us as individuals to exercise our creativity in order to make the world a better place, to help those around us, to improve our communities. It makes us less moral people in the end, actually. And that's a really important unintended consequence that I think we do need to sort of grapple with and keep in mind when we are considering future government policies. So with that in mind, and with my 3 laws of muscular government in mind, I wanted to go back to the sort of 3 examples, concrete examples of policy proposals that we've been hearing a lot of lately from these common good conservative types. And I think that there's a way that we can, and they need to be evaluated and even interrogated in light of lived experience and the lessons from 100 years and thousands of years of human nature. So the first one would be subsidizing child rearing, subsidies for family. We believe that big families are good. This whole conference is here. We've convened to talk about how to be more supportive of families because having children is an incredible blessing and we should be encouraging more of that. All of that is true and I don't deny it at all. But when the question is about whether the state, especially the federal government, should subsidize it, I think you have to go back to the first law of muscular government. The state is bad at everything it does. It often doesn't accomplish the things it's trying to accomplish. It's usually, when it does make progress, it does so in an incredibly wasteful and inefficient way, and often there are unexpected, unintended consequences that make the underlying problem worse. So what would we be opening the door to if we welcomed the federal government into families, into our homes? If we said we're going to accept the federal dollars in hopes that they will then stay out of all the decisions about how we raise our families, about how our kids are educated, about the choices we make about whether to work or to stay, work from home or work in the home or work out of the home. all of these questions. Do we really want to invite the government into the family in that way, into our homes in that way? Is it possible that in the same way that there are unintended consequences that followed from well-intentioned welfare policy, that there could be unintended consequences for families from a policy like this? I think that's a thing we need to grapple with. The second one about regulating big tech or breaking it up if need be. I've even heard the word nationalize used by some of these common good conservatives. We should nationalize. They're really common carriers. They're basically government entities. I think we should think very carefully in light of the second law of muscular government. We won't always be the ones in charge, but whether we want to go down the path of deciding that the government has the right to step into a private business that somebody or some group of people have built up from scratch, that's provided a service to people, that's been wildly successful in the marketplace, and dictate to them the terms under which they may operate. Their terms of service, who they can hire or not hire, what speech they can allow or must allow. Is that really a thing that we want to do, given the fact that the person who might be writing those rules in a few years could be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? That's the question I think we need to ask. We aren't always going to be the ones in charge. And so even if there are really legitimate concerns associated with the power that has accrued to somebody like Amazon or Facebook, sort of seeing the problem and acknowledging the problem is not the same as agreeing with the solutions that are being put forth, I think. And when it comes to this idea that we've embraced a free speech absolutism that's actually harmful, that's bad for families, that we need to accept that the government has a role in regulating and maybe even censoring some speech because some speech is dangerous. I would look to the third law of muscular government, power corrupts. And there's a long, long history of authoritarian governments using speech restrictions to silence dissent, political dissent. And that's a kind of thing that even, I think we have a tendency to think that, well, that couldn't happen here, this is America. Part of the reason that I think it won't happen here is because we have such an incredibly robust jurisprudence around the First Amendment, that speech is a thing that we think is important enough to protect at the highest levels, even when that speech is a little bit dangerous in some cases. So we don't, for example, have laws against hate speech in this country. Those laws have been attempted, and they have been struck down as unconstitutional. And I would say, at this moment in particular, thank God for that. Because can you imagine what the left, think about what the left considers to be hateful in this day and age, and how many of us hold beliefs, us in this room hold beliefs that would be considered to be hateful in the minds of many, many powerful policymakers on the left of center in America today, and how the trends are going in that direction, such that things that could seem innocuous, traditional religious beliefs, one day, a belief that Barack Obama held in 2012 could now be considered grounds for accusations of bigotry. And as it is, there are social sort of efforts at social censorship. So like, you could lose your job if somebody accuses you of bigotry. And there are reasons to be concerned about those kinds of efforts. I do not want to add another tool to the sort of arsenal of those who would come against people with traditional values by saying, not just can they bring the mob against you, but they can actually bring the state against you. They can potentially bring grounds for an arrest or prosecution or something like that. The state is the entity that Max Weber famously described or defined as the institution with a monopoly on the use of violence in society. And so I think we should be very, very careful about giving the kind of power to regulate speech, especially to that entity that also has the right to literally come to your home, put a gun to your head, and haul you away and throw you in a cage. Because although we are very lucky that we haven't faced a lot of that in this country, history is replete with examples of regimes that have abused powers of just that sort. And I want to just finish by saying, I didn't maybe emphasize this fact. I described myself as a libertarian earlier, but I'm also a practicing Catholic. And my faith is very important to me. And I just want to sort of end by making the sort of appeal that nothing that I've said today is in any way contradictory to anything in Catholic social teaching. And in fact, I think it is very much in keeping with the idea of free will that was a gift of God. So this is from the Catechism. God created man a rational being, conferring on him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his own actions. God willed that man should be left in the hand of his own counsel, so that he might of his own accord seek his Creator and freely attain his full and blessed perfection by cleaving to him. Freedom is a gift of God. Free will is a thing that we should be very, very loath and very reluctant, I think, to overrule through the coercive power of the state. That doesn't mean denying the underlying social ills that we're facing, but it means first and foremost looking for voluntary and private civil society level solutions to all problems before sort of turning to the government, and especially before turning to Washington. I live in Washington, guys. I'm telling you, you don't want them anywhere near the problems that we're facing, that we've been most of the problems we've been talking about so far at this conference, I think, are exactly the kinds of things that I want government to be kept farthest away from. I know that is a little bit of a sort of, it can seem like, I think, seem like a cop-out to some people. I get that response a lot when I give talks like this, or when people read articles I've written on these subject matters. I think we have all been trained, and it's a little bit of human nature, to think that, you know, I want to solve this problem now. There's a problem, I want it solved, and we tend to approach the law or public policy like a magic wand. Wave the magic wand and make the problem go away. But I think it's very important to remember that there are no such thing as magic wands in this world, and there usually aren't immediate, instantaneous solutions to problems. That is a sort of that's a fantasy, and probably one that the devil wants us to be tempted by, that you can solve a problem instantaneously. These things are deep problems, societal problems, and they take time to sort of address. And that's frustrating. I share those frustrations, but it doesn't change the underlying truth of the matter. And if we're patient, I think we can move mountains. I would like to sort of end, I think I have a couple more minutes, end with a request for prayers from all of you. I'm going to be flying from this conference home to Florida this weekend to visit my parents because my father is going to be received into the Catholic Church on Saturday. I mention this because he's been married to my mom for almost 37 years, and he has just now decided for some reason to become Catholic. So patience can move mountains. I mean, that really is, I get that it's not a very satisfying solution, but I think it is the one that is available to us and the one that is most in keeping with this incredible gift of free will that we got from God, and with the sort of Catholic understanding of the dignity of the human person and the freedom that is due to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. You are absolutely right about none of what you said being contrary to the Catholic Church. It is writ large in the fourth out of 6 principles of Catholic social teaching called the principle of subsidiarity. It is often ignored, but it is so important that at the end of the day, everything should go down to the lowest level of bureaucratization, the lowest level of social control, and of course the family and the individual should be the resting place, not only of the goodness of human freedom, but the resting place for even social action. So that is certainly commensurate with Catholic social teaching. Moreover, notwithstanding the goods that governments do for defense and social goods like bridges and roads and where there's really necessary social welfare, boy, the cautions you give us about the need for restraint of big government and muscular government, as you called it, these are well advised, going back to the time of de Tocqueville, going back to the time of the Founding Fathers, the Anti-Federalists. Boy, the arguments there are just prolific, and many of them originated with Catholic thinkers, I might point out. And indeed, the second principle of human rights that was developed by the Jesuit Francisco Suarez himself was the principle of what we today call freedom. He called it self-governance, but it means the very same thing, that without which you cannot have a humane society, you know, people don't have the right to govern themselves, as you read so beautifully from our own Catholic Catechism. So thank you very, very much for these really well-advised cautions that we need to take. We cannot lie in a dogmatic slumber. We cannot just abide and allow government to just take over religious liberty, social liberties, economic liberties. We really do have to put on the brakes, because it will soon be our religion and our whole way of life that will be seriously threatened by the ideologies that creep out of just random and increasing bureaucracy. So thank you very, very much for those good cautions. Appreciate it, Stephanie, very much.